Welcome back, everyone. I'm so glad you're joining us. If you're a focused learner looking to truly understand how our modern wealth was built, you're in the exact right place. Today, we're diving into an explainer mapping out the two most influential economic blueprints in modern American history. These are the two competing models that have completely shaped how we work, earn, and live today. Let's jump right in.
Here's our roadmap. First up, two blueprints for prosperity. Then, the Great Compression era, followed by the crisis of stagflation. After that, the rise of Reaganomics. We'll wrap up by comparing the economic outcomes and finally ask the big question, what is an economy for?
All right, let's set up the central tension right out of the gate. Think of it like this. Model A is the post-war era. We're talking high taxes, really strong labor unions, and massive public investments. On the flip side, we have Model B. This is the supply-side approach that kicked off in the 1980s. It totally pivoted toward deregulation, dramatic tax cuts, and private market-driven growth. We are looking at two radically different playbooks for generating broad prosperity.
Part 1. Two blueprints for prosperity, defining the metrics.
Now, to really evaluate how these historical blueprints collected and distributed national wealth, we have to understand one crucial concept first: the marginal tax rate. Listen, this isn't the tax you pay on all your money. That's a common misconception. It's actually the tax applied only to the last dollar earned within a specific income bracket. We need to keep this front of mind because different eras pulled this exact lever to either encourage or totally discourage massive wealth accumulation at the very top.
Part 2. The Great Compression era, the post-war boom.
So running from roughly 1945 to 1975, we have an era economists call the Great Compression. Why? Well, because the financial gap between the richest and poorest Americans literally compressed. It shrank dramatically. And a huge driver of that? 91%. Yeah, you heard that right. In the 1950s, 91% was the top marginal income tax rate. It's a staggering number today, but back then, it basically acted as an effective cap on executive pay. If a CEO is only keeping 9 cents of every dollar above that top threshold, well, corporate boards just didn't have the incentive to push executive compensation to the moon.
This whole era was built on an architecture of shared prosperity. I mean, imagine a time when the Wagner Act gave workers such rock-solid rights to unionize that membership actually peaked at 35% of the entire workforce. That meant wages rose across entire industries, and the government was stepping up with massive public investments too. The GI Bill funded college for millions, and the interstate highway system completely revolutionized commerce across the country. Proponents argue that this specific combo created the most broadly shared prosperity in U.S. history.
But hey, as impartial analysts, we've got to look at the whole picture. Because this era, it was absolutely not a golden age for everyone. Black Americans were systematically excluded from those GI Bill benefits and union protections. Women faced rampant wage discrimination. Plus, we have to remember the U.S. benefited from some incredibly unique post-war conditions, like total global manufacturing dominance and exceptionally cheap oil. Those things had nothing to do with tax policy, right? So that's a major complicating factor when we analyze the data.
Part 3. The crisis of stagflation. The model breaks down.
Okay, so by the late 1970s, this Great Compression model basically hits a brick wall. Enter the crisis known as stagflation. Now, conventional economics at the time literally said this was impossible. You simply couldn't have sky-high inflation and high unemployment at the exact same time. It defied textbook logic. Yet, thanks to massive oil shocks and shifting structural pressures, that is exactly what happened. Policymakers were completely paralyzed. The tools they usually used to fix unemployment just made inflation worse, and vice versa. It was a vicious cycle.
By 1980, inflation had hit a devastating 13.5%. And this wasn't just some boring macroeconomic number on a spreadsheet. Imagine your family's weekly grocery bill jumping double digits year after year. It completely eroded the purchasing power of the American middle class. Savings were wiped out. Confidence in the old Keynesian economic model completely collapsed. Honestly, the country was desperate for a brand new blueprint.
Part 4. The rise of Reaganomics, the supply-side revolution.
And that new blueprint arrived in the 1980s. You might know it as supply-side economics or Reaganomics. The promise here was to rescue a totally stalled American engine through market freedom. The big idea, the theoretical bridge for all this, was the Laffer curve. This model basically suggested that the 70% top tax rates of the 1970s gave wealthy folks massive incentives to just hide their money. Proponents argued that if you cut those rates, you'd bring all that taxable activity out into the open, spur investment, and actually grow the total tax base. And that logic, It helped drive the top marginal rate down from 70% all the way to 28% in just a handful of years.
So what did this new model actually achieve? Well, from the proponents' perspective, it was a massive, undisputed success. First, a fiercely tight monetary policy, known as the Volcker shock, finally broke the back of that double-digit inflation. Then, sweeping deregulation and massive tax cuts freed up tons of capital. This whole era sparked an incredible technological and stock market boom, fostering the rise of Silicon Valley and setting the US up for decades of GDP growth and global competitiveness.
But sticking to our balanced view, we have to look at the critics' data too. Because the theory that these sweeping tax cuts would completely pay for themselves, it failed. Instead, the national debt literally tripled, going from $1 trillion to $3 trillion. On top of that, union membership collapsed as labor markets deregulated, which stripped workers of a ton of bargaining power. And we can't forget that financial deregulation led directly to the savings and loan crisis, which ended up costing taxpayers a whopping $130 billion.
Part 5. Comparing the economic outcomes. The data tells a story.
All right, we've seen the theories, we've walked through the history. Now, how do the actual analytical metrics from these two eras compare? When we consider the productivity-wage gap, the story's pretty dramatic. During the Great Compression, productivity and wages moved in total lockstep. Workers became almost twice as productive, and their pay rose by pretty much the exact same amount. But under the supply-side model, things shift. Productivity keeps climbing, up nearly 70%, but typical worker compensation barely budges, growing just 11.6%. So the wealth was absolutely being generated, but it was no longer being shared equally with the labor force.
And the data shows us exactly where that new wealth went. During the Great Compression, the top 1% captured about 10% of the national income. But under the supply-side model, as union power fell and markets deregulated, that share literally doubled to over 20%. So yes, the overall economic pie grew immensely, but the way those slices were handed out became dramatically unequal.
Part 6. What is an economy for? A question of values. All of this data brings us to a really important climax. We need to step back from the raw numbers for a second and look at the underlying philosophical debate. Because beneath all the math, this is fundamentally a debate about values. The central conflict remains a trade-off between growth and distribution. Is it better to have a faster-growing economy where wealth concentrates at the top, or a more moderate growth rate where the gains are more evenly distributed? Honestly, today's fierce partisan arguments aren't really about the data anymore. Both sides mostly agree on the facts. What they're actually debating is this exact structural trade-off.
Which leaves us with this final provocative thought to chew on. Can we ever build an economic blueprint that achieves both explosive growth and broadly shared prosperity? Or are we just forever stuck choosing between the two? I hope this explainer helps you see exactly how these historical policies actively shape the reality of the wallet in your pocket today. Keep learning, keep asking those big questions, and we'll see you next time.